Perfect. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Edinburgh Debate Union's Scottish election panel. As you know, the election is just in a few weeks, and we are very excited to have a lot of the candidates from the Lothian area here to debate today. My name is Callum Duffy. I'm a third-year student studying history and politics at Edinburgh. I'm originally and currently given restrictions in Ayrshire, and I'm very happy to be chairing this debate for you tonight. So to start us off, each of the candidates will get a 1-minute opening statement, and we will start with hearing from Fred Mackintosh from the Scottish Liberal Democrats, their candidate for Edinburgh Southern.
Good evening. I'm delighted to be here. It's a shame it's not in the debating hall. I say this as a former macer of the debates committee, but that is 30 years ago. And this election, in my view, as a Liberal Democrat, is about putting the recovery first. It's about making sure that we do the work now that needs to be done over the next 4 years of this Parliament to recover from the pandemic and to improve our education system, to tackle the huge uninvestment and lack of action on mental health across both the NHS and wider in society, to decarbonise our housing system and our transport system, to build new homes and to create new jobs in the economy, because we have a lot of people who, of course, have lost those jobs due to the pandemic. This will take the full effort of this Parliament, and it's something the Liberal Democrats are determined to do, because liberalism is about ensuring that there's justice for everybody in society. Because if everyone in society has a just opportunity to thrive, then the whole society will do well. If you start from society and work down, as others would, you end up missing people out. You end up forcing people to conform, and that's not something we want. So as Liberal Democrats, we're quite determined to be practical about delivering the changes over the next 4 years that Scotland needs. All our plans are costed and they're clear and they're focused on achieving it. You can elect more Liberal Democrats in Lothian. If you vote Liberal Democrat on the regional list in Lothian, you will elect a new Liberal Democrat MSP in addition to the ones we already hold. So thank you very much for hearing me. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Fred. I'll now invite Angus Robertson for the SNP, standing in Edinburgh Central.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I've got a minute to introduce myself and a little bit about the SNP and what this election's about, so I will try and be brief. My name's Angus Robertson. I have been around in politics for a while. I was a member of the Westminster Parliament for 16 years. I was the leader of the SNP for a decade at Westminster, so I know a little bit about debating. And I was deputy leader of the SNP for 3 years under Nicola Sturgeon. By profession, I'm a journalist. I was a news editor for the Austrian Broadcasting Corporation, and I was the BBC correspondent in Vienna for the best part of 10 years. So Europe matters a lot to me. I'm delighted to be back in Edinburgh, my home city. I grew up in Stockbridge. I went to Flora Stevenson's primary before going to Broughton High School. So Edinburgh Central I know extremely well. There's probably a good chance that a number of you on this debate are in Edinburgh Central. So you'll know that it's the most marginal Tory-held seat in the country, 610 votes with the SNP in second place. So it's a straight choice between a pro-Brexit, anti-European Conservative up against me, a pro-European internationalist. So if you want to elect somebody who will support the SNP, re-elect Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister, and trusts us all to decide about the country's future in an independence referendum, please vote for me, vote Angus, and use both your votes for the SNP. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angus. I'll now invite Kate Nevens, the Lothian list candidate for the Scottish Green Party. Kate, you have 1 minute.
Thanks, Callum. So I'm Kate. As Callum says, I'm standing for the Scottish Greens on the Lothian list. I'm afraid I have zero background in debating. I did first come to Edinburgh as a student at Edinburgh University back in 2001, and then I was lucky enough to be able to move back again 5 years ago, so make Scotland my permanent home. This election, it comes at a time of unprecedented threats to our rights, our well-being, our climate, and our future. As we recover from the pandemic, the Greens want to see politics being done differently, with people and planet at the forefront. The COVID pandemic has disproportionately affected women, disabled people, and people of colour, and people with low incomes and insecure accommodation. And it's been exposing some of these huge inequalities that are at the heart of our society. The pandemic has also deepened inequalities in our education system and created new barriers to learning and negatively impacted the rights and well-being of students and young people. As we emerge from the pandemic, we need to make sure that we do not simply return to business as usual. The Scottish Greens have practical yet radical plans for a fair and green recovery, where we invest in things like our education, our healthcare, our public services, our rights to things like housing and food, and our natural environment, and tackle the climate emergency as we do it. We need to use this opportunity to build a fairer and a greener Scotland, and we need to vote like our future depends on it.
Thank you, Kate. I'll now invite Maddie Kochman, the Scottish Labour candidate for Edinburgh Central. Maddie, you have 1 minute.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here this evening. So I'm a disability rights activist, policy specialist and community campaigner. And like every Scottish Labour candidate, I'm dedicated to representing the communities in Edinburgh Central who have been let down by MSPs more interested in their own careers than in creating real change for the students, workers and families who live in this city. In line with Scottish Labour's National Recovery Plan, I'm prioritising, firstly, jobs, including guaranteed work for young people, improving paying conditions and ending zero-hours contracts. Secondly, homes, by advocating for rent controls, the regulation of short-term lets and investment in social housing. Thirdly, local government, because our councils' budgets are being slashed and public services are having to close. And lastly, the climate emergency, by investing in renewable energy, decarbonising public transport and insulating our homes. It's clear that Scotland needs real change. Scottish Labour Party is the party with the policies to deliver it, and I hope that on May 6th you'll give both your constituency and regional vote to Scottish Labour. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. And finally, I'll invite Miles Briggs, the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party candidate for Edinburgh Southern.
Thanks very much, Callum, and good evening, everybody who's on this call tonight. It's been an honour to serve you as an MSP over the last 5 years in the Lothian region. And one of the key things I wanted to do when I was elected was make sure that I was available for all students who are lucky enough to be studying here in our great city of Edinburgh when they needed our MSPs for help. And one of the key things which I've learned during this period is mental health is not good enough for students in this city, and our health service isn't able to deliver the services we need. Now, I've been trying as an opposition politician, as a Lothian MSP, to really push that agenda because we need to see investment in mental health services for students when they're studying here. This election, I think we will see a lot of cross-party agreement tonight on what needs to happen, because as we recover, we know the impact which this has had not only on our economy, on our health service, but on students. The fact that you are in different parts of the country, different parts of the world watching this, just shows how your world has been turned on its head and your studies. So I want to make sure, above all, the next Parliament is about delivering opportunities for our young people. We all, I think, cross-party need to focus on that. Looking forward to your questions tonight, and of course I'll have to put my bid in as well. Please vote Conservative twice in Lothian as well. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Miles, and thank you to all the candidates for their opening statements. We'll move on to the first topic of the debate, which is the Constitution. So all of your parties agree that Scotland's current political system needs some kind of improvement or reform. What changes do you believe need to be made to Scotland's constitutional status, its institutions, or its political culture to fix the problems you perceive? Angus, we can start with you for that question.
Well, thank you very much. You're right to point out that to one extent or another, all parties agree that the status quo is not sustainable. Well, I suppose that's a start. The SNP, I guess all of you know, is the party that stands for Scotland's independence, so that our Parliament should have the power to decide over all powers which are currently all policies that are currently decided at Westminster. Why is this such an acute issue in this particular election? Well, those of you who've been in Scotland for a number of years will know that we had a referendum in 2014 on Scottish independence, where people were urged no to vote against independence, because unless they did, we would find ourselves outside the European Union automatically. And then a few short years later, we had a Brexit referendum foisted upon us. And in Scotland, we voted by 62% to remain. But notwithstanding that, we have now been taken out of the European Union, and we have had our European Union citizenship rights taken away from us. Now, for people who care about democracy, and I do, I would prefer to live in a country where we get the government that we elect, that we have the parliament that has the powers to make the decisions over things that really matter, and for us to play our role in Europe and around the world. And that's why the independence question is back on the agenda. There has been a change in circumstances, and as we also know, over the last year, we saw something like more than 22 opinion polls in a row showing that a majority of people in this country want Scotland to be independent. So we go into this election campaign asking and trusting you, the electorate, that we should be able to make this decision in these changed circumstances. And if you re-elect the SNP government and there's a majority in favour of a referendum in the Scottish Parliament, it's exactly what we should do. And any denial of our democratic rights will lead to consequences, which I believe will be the ever-growing rise in support for independence. So independence is on the agenda, firstly, as a democratic question, that we should be able to decide on it. And when we have that referendum, I'll be urging you to vote yes, so that we can rejoin the European Union, so that we can regain our European citizenship rights, that our parliament and our government can make all of the necessary decisions about the things that really matter, creating jobs, creating a more equal society, dealing with the environmental crisis with all of the levers at our disposal, as opposed to having many of these decisions made on our behalf by a political party, the Conservative Party, which has not won a single national election in Scotland since 1955. To me, it is democratically unconscionable that we should go on with this ludicrous situation. Let's change it. Let's be responsible for our own destiny. Let's rejoin Europe, rejoin the world, and get on with being a normal and successful country.
Thank you, Angus. I'll now invite Maddie to talk about what political reforms you believe are necessary in Scotland.
Sure. So to be clear, the Scottish Labour Party opposes Scotland's separation from the United Kingdom on the grounds that it would cause huge economic and social disruption, and that creating new states and new borders does nothing to progress the needs of working class people in Scotland or anywhere else in the world. And we therefore also oppose a second referendum on the question. But that does, because especially at the moment, because as we've heard from other candidates, the next parliament really needs to be focused on a recovery from the pandemic rather than politicians, institutions, journalists, so on, being distracted by a huge constitutional question that we're not in a position to take right now. That doesn't mean to say that the status quo is acceptable. Angus is right to point out democratic deficits with Westminster. But what we don't hear enough is conversations around devolution, not just to Scotland, but to our local authorities to have the powers that they need. We don't hear enough about proportional representation. We don't hear enough about the abolition of the House of Lords. We don't hear enough about how you can improve local democracy and improve participation for marginalised groups. None of these questions are straightforward, but there are changes that can be made. And for me, the United Kingdom remains the best vehicle to redistribute wealth and power across the UK. And that doesn't mean resorting to a sort of Rule Britannia nationalism. It's about being a modern democratic nation. And I think that we need to focus on winning the arguments around that rather than returning to an argument that's already been had. And I would also point out that Angus can't guarantee that an independent Scotland would rejoin the European Union, and that the European Union wasn't the only argument against separation in the 2014 referendum. So I think it's important that we're really careful about these questions and conduct them with a bit of integrity.
Right, thank you, Maddie. Miles, can you tell us what you think are the necessary political reforms that need to come to Scotland?
Thanks, Callum. There's 2 points to your question. I actually have been really interested in how we actually reform our own Scottish Parliament, because I feel over the course of the last session, the Parliament has shown not to be functioning well. And I think most MSPs actually felt that as they left this Parliament to try to seek re-election. So there's a number of things I would like to see. Firstly, in terms of independence, I want us to turn the page on that argument. I think it's incredibly divisive. I certainly know during that referendum it divided families, friends, communities. So I think we need to turn the page on that constitutional argument that was settled for, as the First Minister at the time said, once in a lifetime, once in a generation. But we can reform our Parliament and make it stronger. And I think what I would like to see is where the committees currently aren't functioning well. The centralising agenda, which Maddie touched upon, is one of the things the Scottish Parliament needs to look towards. You know, the SNP created a single police force, and the lack of accountability around that has to be reformed. We need to be able to make sure that communities across Scotland have that opportunity to have their police force held accountable locally. I also think devolving power from Holyrood to our local councils is something we've not done enough of. Again, we've centralised too much in Holyrood, in the hands of the Scottish Government. So I would like to see these things looked at. One of the more controversial issues, which I think this election should be opening a discussion around, is whether or not the Scottish Parliament needs to have a revising chamber and what that looks like, because the committees haven't necessarily done the job they should have in this Parliament. Some of the legislation we've had problems with as well. So I think that's an argument which we'll see growing arms and legs, and it's something I think we can look towards strengthening the Parliament around.
Okay, thank you, Miles. Fred, do you want to tell us about the political reforms the Liberal Democrats propose?
Yeah, I'm a Remainer and a Federalist. And so I campaigned to remain in the European Union because I like the idea that you can have multiple identities. In fact, one of the best things about being a student at the University of Edinburgh, albeit a very long time ago, and then teaching there, was the fact that students and staff shared a range of different identities. We could be British, we could be Scottish, we could be European all at the same time. And that's why it's particularly horrific that our European identity has been sort of ripped from us by the Brexit decision, by a decision made in a single referendum for some particularly dubious reasons, by a lot of lies and deceit about what would actually happen, most of which, of course, have been turned out to exactly what happened. So we as Liberal Democrats want to remain. We don't think that having lost, as it were, one part of our identity, we should rip another part out, because the story of which we hear a lot about people of European origin in Scotland who feel that they have to go through all these hoops to get permanent settled status and convince the government that they should be allowed to remain. We don't want to get into the same sort of cultural arguments about who is Scottish. And before Angus gets cross, I was one of these people who was abused in the referendum campaign, like any no campaigner was, and we're worried it will happen again. We don't want that to happen again. Now, we have to build an alternative future. We have to build a federal UK. We've supported that in the Liberal Democrats for 30 years. Other people have not yet come on board. It's great to see Gordon Brown and bits of the Labour Party taking interest in federalism. We even hear occasional squeaks out of the Tory Party. But a federal UK, like sensible large countries around the world, like Canada, like Australia, like Germany, like India, like Spain and the United States of America, is the solution that we need, where there's a clear balance of power between the different parts of the UK that enables decisions to be made sensibly and rationally without dividing, because that's what I'm concerned about, is ultimately the division of a hard border between Scotland and England. Something the SNP knew was a dangerous thing, and they didn't propose it in 2014, but it will come if we end up joining the European Union as independent state, along with a currency and things. So I'd like to see a federal UK. I'd like to see proportional representation. It doesn't seem that strange that the Prime Minister should have the support of more than half the electorate. I'd like to see in England, I think they should be devolving power with England to the mayors like Andy Burnham and people around the UK, around England. I think that'd be a really powerful way of stopping this terrible, tense fight between Edinburgh and London that seems to break out whenever there's an issue, when both sides weaponize it. And one of the depressing things about this election campaign, and incidentally, not something that Miles has been doing, but I've noticed with some Conservative candidates and some SNP candidates, they love to have the fight. They love to be seen as if they're against each other, that somehow they illustrate an existential crisis. What we actually have to do is come together. We have to stop worrying about borders. We have to try and not worry about identities and focus on what we need to deal with. So federalism is something that we can deal with over the next Parliament down south. We've already delivered a lot. Remember, the Scottish Parliament was created by cross-party working in Scotland between Labour and the Liberal Democrats, the trade unions, and Civic Scotland. It was a collective endeavour to try and find a solution that provided almost all the benefits of independence with none of the costs. And the costs are many. And that's why the SNP were wrong in the 90s, and they're still wrong now. And so I'm a Remainer, I remain a Remainer, I want to continue to be a Remainer. And if there is a referendum, which I don't support, I'll campaign to remain.
Thank you, Fred. I'll now ask Kate to articulate what the Greens' unique vision is on Scottish political reform.
Sure. So the Scottish Green Party and me personally support independence, and we'd want to see an independence referendum within the next term of Parliament, so within the next 5 years and after the pandemic is over. For the Scottish Greens, independence is more of a means to an end than an end in itself. So it's about getting the levers to be able to build a more progressive, sustainable and democratic country. And for us, it really fits into our values around radical grassroots democracy. So bringing decisions as close and as meaningfully to people as possible. So in the event of independence, we wouldn't just be devolving decision-making completely to Scotland, we'd also be looking at making sure the decision-making was as localised as possible. So not just at local government level, but even also at community level. And that's one of the big distinctions, I think, between the Greens and the more centralised model of the SNP's vision for independence. What independence would do, it would give us powers to really complete the job on various things where we can make a start under the current settlement. So at the moment, we can spend money and invest money on energy efficiency, but we can't actually regulate the energy companies. So in order to get us to a net zero carbon country, we need to be able to regulate the energy companies. We need to be able to raise standards on insecure work and poverty pay, and we don't have the levers to do that. The Greens would want to see a living wage, an end to 0-hour contracts, universal basic income brought in, and all of those things can only really be piloted in Scotland as it is. But we have ideas for how to bring in a living wage through things like public procurement until we get independence. I'd also personally really want to see a complete end to the hostile environment that has been created deliberately by an abusive and a racist Home Office, and we would seek to abolish the Home Office entirely. So my background is in international development and kind of peace building. So a lot of my personal feeling about independence is about making sure that we can live in a country that has a feminist and human rights-based approach to external affairs, which we will never get under a UK settlement. I would also want to see us having a completely different approach to defence, so thinking, which will always be reserved, so thinking more about human security globally rather than military and nuclear investments. And I think that's another area where we do differ. Our vision differs quite a lot from the SNP, because the SNP currently supports a lot of weapons manufacturing in Scotland, and that would be something that we would want to see an end to immediately. So yeah, we have a pretty exciting vision for an independent Scotland, a small independent nation that would be inside Europe and working collaboratively with others around the world. We're probably the only party that has about 100 different other Green parties around the world to work with. And we also are part of networks of environmental justice activists and Indigenous communities around the world that are leading the change to tackle the climate emergency. So we see it as a collaborative, collective project as an independent Scotland.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you very much to all of you for your answers on the Constitution. And your answer brings us quite nicely onto our next main topic, which is the environment. So every party in this election is promising Scotland a greener economy, but how are you each proposing that we actually get there? Miles, would you like to start us off on that question, please?
Thanks, Callum. Well, in the last Parliament, I was pleased to support some of the highest standards which we put in place to reduce our emissions, and the UK government obviously just yesterday announced similar schemes to make sure we drive down our emissions. Climate change is something which this election I've been asked about almost as much as education. So I welcome the fact that I think cross-party, we're now looking at this as a key issue. Now, in terms of Scottish Conservatives, one of the hardest things we will face in this next Parliament and in the next 10 years is actually how we decarbonise our home heating schemes and replacing boilers. And this is an issue I think we really need to see the Parliament focus on, because that is probably one of the most expensive pieces of kit each home will have to change in this coming 5-year period. So I want to make sure that in this Parliament we're looking towards how we make individuals and homes able to achieve that. And I hope to see some of the schemes like we've seen, like a boiler scrappage scheme, things like that taken forward. I also think it's important that we give people the tools to try to change their habits. Recycling schemes, Edinburgh is one of the hardest cities to actually recycle in. So I want to see, that's a local authority issue, but us doing more work around that so we can all act individually to change these things and make sure that we're driving down where we can our use. So there's big questions each one of us are going to have to ask, especially around, for example, the consumption of meat. So I think these sorts of arguments, these debates are going to be really important in the next Parliament. And I welcome the fact that actually we've seen quite a consensus starting to already emerge at this election of the actions we have to collectively take.
Thank you, Mayor. So I'd like to ask you and all candidates in these opening statements to try and keep them as short as possible so that we can have a good discussion at the end of it. So I'll move on to Kate and ask what policies the Greens would bring in the next Parliament to secure a greener economy.
Sure. So I think I've said this to Miles before, but I think one of the things we really need to do is watch out for parties that want to shift the responsibility away from governments and regulating corporations onto the individual. And you'll hear that quite a lot when we talk about climate. So with the Greens, we are the only party with the most transformative plans for tackling the climate emergency. We all know that we've only got 9 years left, and we need to be acting on it now. And what we're seeing is other parties that are still very committed to oil and gas extraction. And what we need to be doing is ending oil and gas extraction now, ending licensing now in the same way that New Zealand has done. And all the other parties are still committed to continuing extraction. All the other parties are also still committed to road building when we need to be urgently moving to net zero carbon emission transport. So I think the SNP have committed 155 million into new road building in the last budget. Labour have been talking about an underway motorway in London. The Conservatives have been putting tons and tons of money nationally into road building. So we need to be thinking about public transport and public transport only and quickly. We have some really ambitious targets in Scotland, which is excellent. And it's really great to see all the other parties coming up with ambitious targets. And I do agree that this is something we can work on together. But it should be noted that climate emissions are actually going up in Scotland, and we're missing our climate targets. We've missed our climate targets 2 years in a row, and our transport emissions in particular, that's why I'm talking about road building, are going up. So in terms of what the Greens would do, the main thing to be thinking about is this just transition, but urgent just transition away from oil and gas. And we'd guarantee jobs for oil and gas workers and guarantee that there would be support available for those workers to retrain and get support. We have a £10 billion investment proposal, which would be investing in warm and green homes, renewable energy, public transport, and restoring nature to capture that carbon. And that would be a plan that would create jobs and make our lives better at the same time.
Thank you, Kate. Fred, can you tell us what the Liberal Democrats are proposing?
Yeah, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think the two biggest things the Scottish Parliament can do is decarbonising home heating and transportation. And both are going to be expensive. We want to move 1 million homes to zero emission heating by 2030. And we want to accelerate rail electrification and make all public sector vehicles that are newly purchased to be electric, unless they can't be, but they should be all electric that are purchased. But I think the point that Kate is making is really interesting and worth unpacking for a moment. I'm not suggesting that the Parliament expands its powers in this area. I think we can use the powers we've got to deliver a substantial reduction in carbon emissions and to make the place warmer and more just. However, if we spend the next 4 years trying to persuade everybody to give the Parliament the powers of what Angus describes as a sovereign country, then that will take up the rest of this Parliament. We don't have that time. We can do a lot with the powers we have. If we spend the next 4 years arguing about independence, then a lot of this complex stuff, just take cities. There are some really interesting ideas happening across Scotland about changing the nature of transport in cities, active travel, investment in rail, investment in buses. We don't have a bus system which operates well enough. Bus passengers is dropping outside Scotland. If you live in Edinburgh, you know Lothian buses is amazing. Outside it, there's no such thing. We need to create nationally controlled or locally controlled bus services. These changes will require persuading people and encouraging people and debating with people about the changes we're going to make, because we all are nervous about making the changes and we all have to make them. We don't have the capacity in this Parliament to do a massive constitutional rewrite to create the radical powers that Kate is describing and do the stuff we need to do now. So we need to do the stuff we need to do now. Now, I don't have a lot of confidence in the Conservative government on climate change, but I am conscious that they do set pretty ambitious targets. So we hold their feet to the fire and we do what we can, particularly in heating, particularly in transport. And there's lots we can do.
Angus, I'll let you tell us what the SNP are proposing on the green economy. Angus, you're muted.
There's always one, isn't there? There's always one.
You go now.
Well, I would firstly like to reflect on the fact that I think it's great that there's quite a lot of consensus about the importance of the environmental challenge that we face, and the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis are a reality that we have to face. We have to face that right now. So, not going away. And even in the midst of the pandemic, the climate emergency remains a pressing crisis for us in Scotland and right round the world. So a couple of things, bullet points. We need to increase our progress towards becoming a net zero nation. I think we can demonstrate our climate leadership on the global stage at the forthcoming COP26 in Glasgow. Just observing one fact about our situation in Scotland now, we are now producing more than 97% of our energy requirements by renewables, which is a remarkable achievement. And we haven't even begun to exploit the renewables potential that we have offshore. We're going to be a net renewables producer and exporting to other countries that aren't so fortunate. And obviously in Scotland, under the SNP, we do not foresee a role for nuclear power going forward. A couple more bullet points have not been mentioned by others. We need to invest in nature-based solutions. That is definitely something we should be dealing with, as well as promoting climate justice. We need to decarbonize the way that we heat our homes, revolutionize our transport system as part of the plans to become a net zero nation. That involves reducing the use of cars. We need to green our agriculture. We haven't heard yet from other panelists about the opportunity to become a leading hydrogen nation. So definitely an area that the SNP is committed to. We oppose fracking. There's absolutely no need for it in a country that has so many renewable energy resources, and we need to build a circular economy. For people who are interested in all of this, even in hustings, we can't go through all of the things that our parties are standing on. So I would encourage people who are interested in this, have a look at our manifesto. I'm sure my fellow candidates on the panel would say the same as theirs. So if you're wanting more detail, because there's a lot of detail, certainly in our manifesto, please have a look online, and that will answer any of the questions that you haven't heard suggestions to so far. But I think we have a good story to tell in Scotland. We're lucky we have won on the natural lottery twice, once oil, and now as oil is receding as a resource, and it's also not something that we can rely on, should we rely on and should exploit in the way that we did in past decades. We need to reflect on the fact that Scotland is literally the Saudi Arabia of renewables in Europe. And we need to make sure that the renewables that we can produce, we get to other countries that are not as fortunate. So together with energy-rich countries in and around us, from Iceland to the Faroes to Norway and ourselves, we need an interconnector to get the energy that we will be producing in surplus to countries that are energy dependent, including England. And we would be happy to provide that, of course.
Thank you, Angus. Maddie, can you tell us, as Scottish Labour, the only party that has not published the full manifesto yet, what we can look forward to in your party's manifesto in regards to the green economy?
Sure, as Angus mentioned, it's really hard to not to refer to a manifesto that hasn't been published yet, but we have published our climate recovery plan as part of our national recovery plan. And I was interested in a lot of what Kate was saying around how this responsibility can only really be achieved through government intervention. And government intervention in regulation of markets is what the Labour Party is really strong on. It's second nature to us to try and look at the way in which businesses are behaving and intervene in order to create change that is in the interests of the people who live in this country. And I think this is really important because too often the concept of a just transition is just thrown around as though, you know, it's something that we need to consider. And actually, it needs to be at the heart of our plan for a climate recovery, because the changes that we need to make, the interventions that have to be made in our industrial strategy to achieve carbon neutrality are enormous and will have massive impacts on working class people throughout Scotland if we're not careful. So the fact that the Labour Party is the party of trade unions, is the party of the just transition model, has relationships with the trade union movement across the world, that is really important, because otherwise we're going to end up in a situation where we're advocating for massive economic change and we're not taking into account the needs of the most vulnerable people in Scotland. And I also think that, as well as that kind of massive national and international change that has to happen, there are things that need to be done locally that can also support working class people. So, for example, insulating homes can lift people out of fuel poverty, decarbonising public transport can tackle air pollution, which we know is a really big problem in our city. So for me, carbon neutrality is really important, but we have to take care of people as we transition towards it. And, you know, as has been pointed out, Scotland claims to be a world leader on this issue, but is repeatedly missing targets. And it's time that we match those big words with the big actions that are necessary.
I'd like to thank you all for those statements. I'd like to invite Kate or Miles if they want to come back and respond to anything that's been said after they spoke. Or if any of you have anything to say on, for example, the renationalisation of ScotRail, how that factors into your party's plans. Fred, would you like to go on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the renationalisation of ScotRail, or rather the creation of a national company to operate the passenger services, is really important. But we need to integrate it with buses. When the Liberal Democrats were in coalition with Labour up until 2007, we tried to regulate buses to get away from this market-driven bus economy that Margaret Thatcher brought in across the rest of Scotland, outside Edinburgh. And the system that we created was, I think, on reflection, too complicated. It never worked. The SNP tried again. They tried to enable councils to take some control of buses. Again, it was too complicated. We need to have a system where the councils and communities that make them up decide where the routes are, decide when the buses run, and we run it like London. So we actually have buses going where people want them to go, connecting with the trains, connecting with ScotRail, so that we provide a truly integrated transport system across the country. We can't wait for the market to solve this. We tried that. That was 15 years ago. And a nationally integrated system like you get in many European countries and in London is exactly what we need.
Angus, obviously, Fred said that he believes that the SNP didn't get it right on buses. Would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think it's absolutely right that we do begin the process of accelerated switching from cars to buses. And we intend to reduce the use of cars measured as car kilometres by 20% by 2030. And a part of the way of being able to do that is to make bus travel more attractive and reliable. And in our manifesto that has been published, we are committed to investing over £500 million to improve bus infrastructure and tackle congestion. Of interest to the younger participants in this evening's meeting, we're also extending free bus travel to everybody under 22
And that
years.
was a Green Party,
So,
and the Greens pushed for that.
I'm delighted there's cross-party agreement, Kate. We should be celebrating the fact that there's a growing consensus, and we can invite the other parties to endorse such a policy. I think it's a good move that we can create a greener and a more affordable railway with higher standards, and doing that by bringing ScotRail into public hands from next year. And decarbonising Scotland's rail services by 2035. So I think there are lots of things that we can do and we should do. Unfortunately, there are other things that we can't do without the full powers of a parliament. And unlike Fred, who doesn't seem to believe it's possible to deliver constitutional change and also deal with other policy options, we can't put this off. So we need to deal with our shortcomings in terms of governance and the powers that we can exercise in Scotland at the same time as using the powers that we do have to deliver in important areas like this. And we need to get on with it and not wait for the fiction of a federal UK that's never going to happen to solve our problems.
Obviously, you mentioned consensus. We're going to move on to the COVID-19 recovery, which everybody agrees is an important issue. If your party leader was elected as First Minister, what would their COVID-19 recovery priorities be in the first 100 days? Maddie, do you want to briefly kick us off, as well as if you want to respond to anything that's just come before you, feel free to do so.
Yeah, very quickly, I would just like to say that the SNP were forced into renationalising ScotRail after years and years of its abysmal record and increasing fares. So I think that it's wrong to suggest that the SNP were sort of like clamouring to intervene in the transport market. That's not what happened, and it should have happened sooner. So just to correct that. Yeah, on the national recovery, Scottish Labour has produced a national recovery plan which covers communities, economy, climate, jobs and education, as well as our manifesto, which will have detail of policy across the board. So recovery means lots of things to lots of people, but for me a priority has to be jobs. And I find it quite interesting that it's only because of this international crisis of a pandemic that people in other parties and other ideologies have suddenly realized that our economic system is broken. So the way in which power is distributed through employment in this country is really poor. So that is why women and people of colour and disabled people have been hit so hard by the economic crisis. So we have to have a focus on jobs, which includes improving pay and conditions, especially for key workers, which includes guaranteed work for young people who are looking at a recession, which we know can really damage employment and chances throughout life. But also, talking about the gig economy, 0 hours contracts, living wage. These are all policies that Labour has been advocating for a long time. We haven't suddenly decided that because of the pandemic, now is the time to implement them. These things have always been needed. So yeah, in terms of jobs, that's our focus for a national recovery. But we also have plans across the board.
Thank you, Maddie. Miles, what would Douglas Ross's main COVID-19 recovery priorities be in his first 100 days if he was elected First Minister?
Thanks, Callum. Can I also jump back to the last question, just in terms of some of the transport issues which we ended up going along the lines of? Because I think, and I'd really like to see the next Parliament focus on investment in new railway stations and actually in new railway lines reopening. The beaching cuts, which we saw, are actually slowly being reversed, but I would certainly like to see, and I know Fred and I have been campaigning on the reopening, for example, of the South Suburban network and giving people these options of using rail. It's pretty crazy that today in Scotland, some of our railway network is slower than it was in Victorian times. So I think we need to look at that investment and try to take these projects forward. The Parliament has in a few cases, but I would like to see a proper railways bill to look at these potential reopenings. In terms of number one priority, it has to be getting our NHS back up and running properly. I was lucky enough to serve as Shadow Health Secretary over the course of most of this Parliament. And as we went into the pandemic, the idea that we were going to cut services down to actually build up the NHS to be prepared for COVID-19 has had huge impacts across our services. Waiting times are going through the roof as we speak tonight, and we need to see that investment and a proper plan to restart our NHS and to actually address some of this. The SNP government had a policy of a waiting time guarantee, which the government never met. That now is something we need to see properly funded to make sure that we have waiting times driven down and the work put in to make sure that people who need services are getting them. Here in Lothian, for example, older people are waiting up to 2 years sometimes to get access to mental health support. Some children are being asked to wait up to a year and actually having referrals to mental health services rejected. So we know that task is going to be huge. As Conservatives, we've committed to spending £2 billion on that restart over the next Parliament, and working, I think, with our health boards to see how we can turn this around, because our NHS really needs that focus in the next Parliament to restart it and address some of these growing waiting lists.
Thank you, Myers. Angus, if Nicola Sturgeon was re-elected, what do her first 100 days look like in helping Scotland recover from COVID-19?
Thanks very much. Well, the first task of the next Scottish Government is to complete the reopening of the economy and society while trying to suppress the virus. And that's a difficult balancing act, but the SNP has a clear plan on this and is committed to providing the strong leadership that Scotland needs to take the difficult decisions. And I'm confident that if we stick with it, if we follow the guidance, keep looking out for one another, we can move through the critical phase of the pandemic and back into a world that feels more normal. It will be a new normal. I can't look past one key element to this, which is leadership. And as we know, it's been well demonstrated that the leadership of Nicola Sturgeon through the pandemic has been across the political parties admired and respected. And I mean, there is only one party that is running in this election to lead the Scottish Government after these elections, and that's the SNP with Nicola Sturgeon as First Minister. And I think it's really important that we have her experience, her commitment, and her empathy in getting through what is immensely challenging. There are other things that we need to do. We need to learn the lessons of what has worked and what has not worked. And Nicola Sturgeon has been the first head of government in the UK to commit to a timescale for the inquiry that has to be held to learn the lessons about this. I think one of the things that I fear, having gone through what we have gone through, is unfortunately we are going to face other challenges from viruses. It may not be COVID, it might be something very different, but because of how the world now works and how we're only one plane journey away from countries that have Ebola and other forms of virus, that we may face, it won't take another 100 years from Spanish flu to coronavirus to face some of these challenges. So we have to make sure that what we have learned out of this experience means that we will be better prepared to deal with a challenge in the future. So we should be following our predictive measures. As we know, we need to retain the best provisions to stop the importation of new strains, because coronavirus is not going to disappear even if the vaccination process continues. We need to find our way back out, both in public health terms, and Miles is right to highlight that the NHS has had to deal not just with coronavirus, but all of the other things the NHS has to deal with, and that has been a real stretch. So I'm sure I speak for everybody on the panel. Huge admiration to everybody, both in the NHS and all of the caring professions, in trying to deal with things over the last year. And let's not forget everybody who has found it tremendously difficult in the economy. People who run businesses have had their backs to the wall, and they want to get back to running their businesses, and I completely understand that. And we have to do that as quickly and as safely as we can so that we can bounce back and people's businesses can succeed again. We can do that as quickly but as safely as possible. The tension will remain in trying to balance those two things. And I'm confident that if the SNP is re-elected, Nicola Sturgeon will continue to do that as well as she has done so to date.
Kate, can I ask what are your party's co-leaders' main recovery priorities?
Oh, thanks for noticing that we have co-leaders. Excellent. So Angus talked a lot about leadership there. And Greens are obviously one of the smaller parties, not the smallest, but one of the smaller parties in Parliament. But we've managed to play a really constructive role as an opposition party, negotiating with the government during the pandemic. And we've been able to get successes, a lot of successes, around things like making sure that all primary school children have free school meals. And that's something that we would want extended to all primary school children and all secondary school children if we were to have our First Ministers. I don't know what happened in that case. We pushed the government really hard to reverse the unfair exam grades that came out at the beginning of the pandemic. We made sure that anyone working in the public sector, so nurses, teachers, teaching assistants that earn under £25,000 received a pay rise. We made sure that 500,000 of the most vulnerable families in Scotland got a pandemic relief payment. We introduced a tenants hardship fund and banned winter eviction. So we've been doing an awful lot in terms of recovery already. And that's the kind of, imagine what we would be able to do if our MSP numbers doubled, which is what the polls are currently saying. So even if we didn't have a First Minister, we're looking to double the amount of impact that we could have on areas like that. So we'd be, in terms of priorities, we'd be looking to reverse the horrible impacts of decades of austerity by properly investing in our public sector, recruiting more teachers, recruiting more additional support needs teachers, paying our public sector workers properly. Like Miles, we'll be investing in mental health. I think we're saying that we'd invest at least 235 million more a year in mental health services. We'd work with people like Maddy as an activist and or as an MSP on things like living rent. So we would immediately bring in rent controls and try and reduce the skyrocketing rents that are happening, particularly in Edinburgh, but all across Scotland, and try and rebalance. We've got a number of things, have a look at our manifesto, a number of things that would rebalance the power dynamic between landlords and tenants. One of the things that we've also managed to push through is a fairer income tax model in the last year, and we'd be looking to push through more progressive taxation options. So including increasing, making sure that rich people pay more in income tax, and that those of us who earn less pay less. We'd also be looking to bring in a windfall tax, which it would tax those massive companies like Amazon who've made an absolute packet off the pandemic. And we'd also be looking to bring in a wealth tax. So anyone who has assets, financial assets over $1 million, would pay a wealth tax on their assets. So yeah, a bunch of different things. We'd also start the school age later. So that's quite a big thing. So I think the Lib Dems support that as well. So we'd probably be working with the Lib Dems on making sure that we are more in line with how education happens in Europe, and that you have much more play-based education in the early years. And for us, that's a really important part of recovery from the pandemic, because the children haven't just missed out on academic learning, which is what a lot of people are worried about. They've missed out on social time, they've missed out on playtime, and they've also had to deal with an awful lot of pressures that would not, so one of the things we would do is massively reduce testing across primary school and also in secondary. So yeah, more play-based learning.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, Maddie, do you want to?
Well, can I come in and answer the question?
I'll let Fred jump in because Kate mentioned the.
So I thought Maddie had already answered this one at the beginning of it.
Oh, sorry, I hadn't.
I'll let Fred come in, and then Maddie can say something briefly, and then we'll.
Yeah, because I mean, you in the unlikely event I accept that Willie Rennie is First Minister, I need to answer the question. And the thing that I think is striking about the answer from Angus and Kate is they have an awful lot of priorities. And this is the problem. We have a lot to do coming out of this pandemic. After 14 years of SNP administration, there's a lot needs sorting out. Angus's description of coming out of the pandemic is absolutely accurate. It will dominate government life for a year or more. And I'm deeply impressed by the fact that Kate thinks that everything she's just listed can be done within 100 days. I want to focus on three things. And these are what our priorities are. The first thing is schools, an education bounce back plan in schools, which would involve ensuring that every single teacher in Scotland is employed. No teachers are on temporary contracts, because any teacher who's employed with pupil equity fund money from the Scottish government is on a temporary contract because it's not a permanent scheme. We need to make sure that those teachers are given the capacity and equipment and kit needed to make sure that better value is made of their time, so they can teach young people who are still at school to catch up. In the universities and graduate field, conscious that employment will be beckoning for many people on this call, I finished my degree in a little recession. It was tough. We would have a funded graduate internship scheme available so that people can, in small and medium-sized enterprises, because it's often hard to get a job as a graduate in small and medium-sized enterprises. Miles has mentioned mental health, as has Kate. It's a huge area. It requires massive investment. It is, frankly, abhorrent that after 14 years of SNP power, they're in the state they are. It's horrific. If you even think about the drug deaths, which is a related issue, it requires major effort because we're all having a tough time. Many of us are good at putting up a good front, some perhaps less so, but we're all having a tough time, and we have to make sure that existing problems are addressed, because if we let this fester, it will harm a lot of people and blight a lot of futures. And finally, we just start work on the complex environmental policy we just talked about. They will take time, they will take effort, they will take thought. I'm a lawyer, and I know that some of these things are complicated, and they need to be done right. And if they're not done right, they'll be subject to court challenges. It took, 3 years to introduce minimum prices for alcohol after the bill was passed, because it went all the way to the European Court. We can't afford to let that happen to the bus policy or what we do about zero carbon heating. We need to focus on what needs to be done. We should tackle the pandemic now and not distract ourselves with another referendum, because we haven't got the time. Because Angus may think he's a superhero, but 14 years of SNP power proves you can't do two things at once. We need to focus on the recovery.
I'll very quickly, Maddie, if you have a 1 minute response, and then I'll very quickly let Angus respond to what Fred has just said, and then we'll move on to the Q&A section.
Yeah, thank you, and apologies for Fred. I didn't mean to try and skip the queue. I was just Kate cited a lot of things that have been done during the pandemic, and I just wanted to flag that Scottish Labour supported a lot of the policies that she cited. But I would also say that it is really important that we acknowledge that one of the reasons that coronavirus deaths in the UK, including Scotland, are among the highest in the world is because the system in this country is broken. Our economic model has allowed the rise in insecure work. Our public services are completely run down. The housing market is out of control and people can't afford to stay in their homes. And who has been in power for the last decade? I turned 18 in 2010, which means for my entire adult life, the Tories and the Lib Dems in Westminster and the SNP in Edinburgh have been in power, and they have done nothing to address those fundamental, the fabric of our society that has been broken by this pandemic. So I don't understand how these parties can come forward and say, trust us with the recovery, when they've been asking us to trust them for the last decade, and the system that they have failed to challenge has been put to the test and been found wanting. Scottish Labour is the only party that can bring us through this with a recovery focused on equality and changing our economy for a sustainable future.
So that we can move on to the Q&A, I'll give Angus maybe 30 seconds and Miles 30 seconds if you want to respond to Maddie, but Angus, very quickly.
Just very briefly on the point of being able to do two things at the same time. I think it's important to realise that there is no status quo anymore. Scotland's future is either part of Brexit Britain, which means, like the Liberal Democrats or the Labour Party, you give up on your commitment to the European Union. We're not prepared to do that. What we are prepared to do is to give the people a choice in a referendum. And Fred can argue against it, and he can explain how a federal UK could work. The only example of federalism in the world ever, where 85% of the population lives in one part of a confederal state. It has only ever worked in Serbia and Montenegro for a few years. It is an unworkable model. We can't sit around and allow Brexit to damage the fabric of our society, our international relations, and our trade with the largest single market in the world. I'm not prepared to put up with that, and I'm also not prepared to put up with the democratic deficit of having large parts of the decisions about our lives made by a party that we haven't elected. Now, Fred can accept that. He can live with that, or the Labour Party can live with the Tories being in charge when we haven't voted. I'm not, and I don't think the people of Scotland are. So, yes, is it a challenge to do a number of things at the same time? Of course it is. But that's what we go into politics to do. It's the art of the possible. And every other of our neighbouring countries does it. The Irish have done it. The Icelanders have done it. The Norwegians have done it. The Danes have done it. The Swedes have done it. I'm sorry that Fred thinks uniquely we are incapable of doing what they do. But they have managed both. We can manage both. And frankly, we should just get on with it.
Thank you, Angus. I'll very quickly, Miles, if you want to take just a quick minute to respond, and then we will move to the Q&A section.
Thanks, Callum. Well, I think for most people I've been speaking to over the last few weeks when we've been out campaigning, they want us to focus on what matters to them, and that's the cost of living, which this pandemic has really highlighted, their job, a lot of people who have been working from home, but above all our NHS, like I outlined, restarting that, making sure that those relatives who are waiting for operations, their children who are waiting to get support for mental health services, and our schools, you know, are restarted. One of the hardest things I've had during this pandemic is a number of people who've contacted me about their children to say that their children have developed eating disorders, anxiety issues, self-harming issues, and actually they're not being the support they're available for them. These are the things which people, I hope at this election, will make sure that politicians are focused on, because arguing over the constitution for the next 5 years isn't going to address these problems in our country. And so I hope we're going to focus on that and leave the divisions of the past behind us and move on as a country.
Thank you, Miles. I would like to
quickly respond to Fred.
In 15 seconds, if that's possible.
Not being able to do my few things in 100 days. And so I would say that this absolutely is the time for transformative, radical approaches and transformative change. Like, what the pandemic has shown us is that everything is not working and we need to do it completely differently. And if we go into the next 100 days in Parliament with tweaks of the system or step changes to the system, and we don't look at how we value care work that has shown how under pressure and underpaid and undervalued women are in our society, if we don't start looking at that in the first 100 days, we will not change things. So this is the time for transformative change.
I would love to give all of you more time to go back and forward, but we have an audience that has been sitting patiently, and I'm sure would love to ask you all their own questions. So thank you very much for answering my questions. This has been a very informative debate so far, I'm sure. Bryn, I believe we're stopping the recording and allowing people to ask questions.
We won't stop the recording, but if people don't want to have their names published or don't want to appear online in the recording, then they can privately message me, Callum. So anything that says Edinburgh Debates Union or Callum, if you just send us a direct message in the Zoom chat, we'll be more than happy to ask your question anonymously for you. If you would like candidates, just put yourself in the Zoom chat and then Callum will call upon you when he's ready.
Yep. So does anybody have a question right away? Yeah, we have, what would immigration look like for an international student, not European, in an independent Scotland if that referendum goes through? I'll start with Angus, I think.
Super simple, as welcoming as possible. So one of the great things about Scotland is that we're not full. Our issue, the challenges that we have had to deal with in Scotland are not immigration in the past historically, it has been immigration. And Scotland has benefited tremendously by people coming here through the ages. I'm a product of that. My mother came here as a refugee just after the Second World War. As we know, Scotland has over the decades and centuries seen people arrive here for different reasons. So whether people have come here to study or they have come here seeking refuge, we are committed to having a welcoming approach to immigration, a very different approach to that of the UK government. if you want to have a look at what was proposed specifically in relation to the 2014 independence referendum in the white paper, it's laid out in detail there. I should say, incidentally, not just in reference to leave to remain or being able to study here, which we think is fantastic, incidentally also for people to go and study elsewhere in Europe and the world, which is why we mourn being taken out of the Erasmus scheme, but also when it comes to citizenship, which will be based on who's here and who has a connection with here, as opposed to the way the UK has been managing a restrictive system, which is has caused such difficulty and heartache. So a welcoming system which is inclusive, yeah, I'm delighted that Edinburgh is such a European and international city. I'm a product of it myself, and long may that continue.
Okay, we have another question here, which is, what will you do in the next 5 years to help the over 400,000 rare disease community? Miles, you're nodding along there. Would you like to go first on that question?
Sure, yeah. Do you want me to cover both questions or just that one on rare disease?
I think just the rare disease community question for just now.
Sure. This is an issue which I chair a number of cross-party groups in Parliament, and one of the commitments which I want all parties to take forward is actually for us to have a rare disease strategy. There's a number of cancers, over 100 cancers, which are the less survivable cancers. So I also want us to see work done on that. Too often the NHS has not looked at some of these opportunities, and making sure our NHS professionals are able to actually deal with patients with symptoms, with often difficult conditions, is something I think we need to improve in the Parliament. So I'm keen that we look towards a new strategy, and I'm working with a number of charities who are advocating that during this election to do just that.
Okay, I'll let Kate take that question, and then we'll move on to the next question.
So I was actually diagnosed with a relatively rare form of cancer a couple of years ago. So I have some understanding of what it's rare in people my age and gender, rather than a completely rare form of cancer, to be fair. But I think it's a lot about making sure that people get timely and accurate diagnosis and what we can do to support that. Raising awareness, because actually my cancer was treated as if it was rare, but it's clearly growing amongst people my age. So the doctors were talking to me like it was a rare thing, but actually it's clearly not as rare as it says in the medicine books. So raising awareness, that quite a lot of people do, and it's called rare, but actually quite a lot of people get rare diseases overall. And making sure that people have access to properly coordinated care. So I was quite impressed, to be fair, with both the coordination between the NHS and Macmillan with my care, but making sure that that's coordinated and everyone's trained and aware of these different rarer diseases.
I can actually very quickly let Maddie come in, if you want to come in on the rare disease question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, similar to Kate, I have a visual impairment that was caused by an incredibly rare neurological condition when I was a child, and specialist NHS services are incredibly important. And I think what's been happening recently with the Eye Pavilion in Edinburgh, which was threatened, and then councillors voted to invest in it, and then the SNP government stood in its way and then changed their mind just in time for the election, shows how little care is being given to people who have specific needs in accessing healthcare. But I also think that there's a bigger question here around research, and the fact that at the moment we've all been very impressed with the way that the pharmaceutical industry has come through for us with the coronavirus vaccine, but actually one of the reasons that rare diseases are so have so few treatments is because it's not profitable. So again, as I've said before, this is all about intervening in markets in order to make them function for the people who need that, including people with rare diseases.
Thank you. The next question, I will move through each of the candidates and ask you for a very quick yes or no for this one. Would the party support the establishment of further citizens' assemblies in Scotland? Fred, yes or no?
Yes, we also want to increase the powers of local government and offer the opportunities to communities to create more borough councils in small communities. Scotland is far too centralised.
Maddie, yes or no?
Yes.
Miles, yes or no?
Yes.
Angus, yes or no?
Yes, it's in the manifesto. We've done it already. We'll be doing it if we win after the election.
And Kate, yes or no?
Yes, absolutely. Yep.
Okay, I have a question about the Labour Party. How would the Scottish Labour Party deal with any contradictions between Scottish Labour and British Labour?
So the
Maddie?
Scottish, thank you. So Scottish Labour Party have our own manifesto. We have our own MSPs. We're comfortable with there being different priorities and different nuances to our policy across the UK. And we don't regard that as a tension. We regard that as a party that's able to respond to the communities that we're trying to represent. So we deal with it like grown-ups and like a democratic party that has structures that makes its own decisions.
Okay, we have what measures do you support to increase tenants' rights? Angus, we can come to you on this one.
Right, sorry, just double checking that I'm not muted.
We can hear you.
So the SNP has been increasing tenants' rights during this Parliament and is committed to continue doing so into the next parliamentary term. In Edinburgh, as many of you know, we have particular pressures on the housing market, and that's why it's absolutely necessary to take moves to deal with, especially the kind of challenges we have from the preponderance of short-term lets. So we need to deal with areas where there are particular pressures, and we need to deal with unregulated short-term lets as a challenge. So that's one area where the SNP is going to be continuing the work that it has been doing in this current Parliament. But I think more than that, we need to make sure that we actually have the housing stock that is required, and we have to make sure that it is of a standard and affordability that people can pay for. And that's why the SNP is committed to building 100,000 houses over the next Parliament. And we shouldn't sniff at numbers like that. It's a really, really big commitment. The last time other parties were in government in Scotland, that was a Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. I think I'm right in saying they delivered 14 houses. That's not 1,400. That's not 14,000. It's 14.
No, that's council houses. You're not counting the housing association. That's not true.
The SNP is
I'll
committed
let you come in a
to
second,
100,000
Fred.
houses, of which more than 70% is at an affordable rate. So I think between the tenancy rights issues of improving that and increasing the housing stock, I think is something that we should embrace in the next parliamentary term.
Fred, I'll let you respond to that and also talk about your party's proposals specifically for tenancy rights.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a bit of misinformation, the SNP. During the first two terms of Parliament, there was a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition. It didn't build many council houses. It built an awful lot of housing association properties. And that's how it chose to build its housing. Now, you can argue about whether housing association or council houses are better. Personally, I think council houses are probably better in the long term. But the point is, to say we only built 14 it's just misinformation. Now, what will we do? I think the point about Airbnb in Edinburgh is extremely well made. I think the work that Andy Whiteman, MSP, did in Lothian is really, really powerful. And certainly if I was elected MSP, I'd like to build upon that, particularly in the area of planning permission, the lack of it rather, for short-term lets, because we need to get these properties available for tenants. And that probably means the council needs to be funded to investigate properties that don't have permission and really ought to. It did that before. With HMOs when they came in 2003 when I was a councillor. Scottish Government funded extra planning officers, extra lawyers to make sure that they could inspect these properties. The same thing needs to happen. It's not currently in the SNP plan. In terms of tenants' rights, I think we need to ensure that properties are inspected faster. Now, one of the things that I find as a lawyer is that you can only exercise your legal rights if you have information, you have money. Legal aid needs to be made available more for housing, and also we need to make sure that we actually have a council service so that if you're worried about your part of your property that's being inspected or should be inspected by the council has resource to do that. And those areas, I think we can make major difference for tenants. But we also need to build more housing, and we need to activate the 8,000 sites for housing in the north of the city, which have been landlocked for 10 years in and around the waterfront, because the more housing we can build in the city, the more affordable rental properties there can be as well. But I'm sure Maddie has a lot to say, because she and I did a really interesting fair rent hustings. We didn't agree on everything, but I know she'll fill you in more details.
I'll let Maddie come in on that question and then we'll move on to the next question.
Thanks, Fred. That's very friendly of you. Yeah, so I'm an activist with the Living Rents Tenants Union, and housing policy is really important to me, as I know it will be for many people on the call. I'm not quite sure what Angus is referring to when he says that the SNP have made great moves on this. The rent pressure zones policy that was brought in 2015, I believe, has never led to any regulation of any tenancies in Scotland at all. It's basically impossible to implement, and it doesn't actually allow you to bring rents down, which is why I advocate for Living Rent's model of rent controls, which is designed to link rents to affordability and also to quality, to drive up quality in the private rental sector. And I was one of the Labour members who took that to our national conference to make that Scottish Labour policy. And that got turned into the Fair Rents Bill that Pauline McNeill took to Parliament. And that was a bit watered down in the effort to create parliamentary consensus. And it was still voted down by SNP and Tory MSPs at committee stage, so it was never heard by the full chamber. So you'll forgive me if I don't accept Angus's claimed support for tenants' rights when his party is simply not doing enough. They've been too slow to tackle sky-high rents. They've been too slow to tackle Airbnb, with whom their housing minister meets on a regular basis. And I don't see any real understanding that the housing crisis, particularly in Edinburgh, is a class issue. It's not a geographic issue. It's a failure to intervene in the market and to redistribute what is a human right to people who need it, whether they can afford it or not.
I'll move on to the next question and let Miles and Kate come in on this question. What are your specific plans or actionable steps on improving the mental health care services rather than just increased funding? Miles, do you want to go on that?
Sure. Well, funding's obviously important. And, you know, when you look at the NHS in Scotland, we only spend around 8% on mental health. In England and Wales, they're up to 10%. So we're saying we want to lift funding to that. But where that funding goes is important. So one of the key things for students, I want to see a national student mental health action plan to very much look at mental health services for students. But we need to actually build services beyond the NHS, because it's quite clear that demand and capacity are not matching. So I think the third sector have a hugely important role to play in this. I know from some of the organisations who are already providing crisis mental health services in the city that they want to do more. So I want to see the third sector really tasked at how we can have early intervention, because there's no point us building as a country the best crisis service for mental health. We need early intervention at every age and for specific groups as well. So for example, I've done a lot of work with Edinburgh's men's sheds across the city, and that's making a huge difference for a key group of people in the city. And we need to see that sort of model rolled out across mental health services, but above all about early intervention.
Kate?
Yeah, just to link it back to the housing question, these things are very, very linked. So the extortionate costs of rent and the horrific conditions of many of the rental properties in Edinburgh, I think we're looking at like 30% of rented properties in Edinburgh are damp or uninhabitable in some way. That's driving a poverty crisis, it's driving a fuel poverty crisis, and it's driving ill health, both physical ill health and mental ill health. So just to say that I support and the Greens support the Living Rent manifesto and many of the things that Maddie said around actually not just fairly specific interventions to bring down rent and also to bring private rented accommodation back into the public and social sector. So on mental health, yeah, I completely agree with the questioner that it's not all about money. We do tend to sound a bit like we're in a bidding war, like how many houses are we going to build, how much money are we going to put in mental health, and I completely agree with that. So I think it's about, for me, it's a few things. It's not about just, a lot of us talk about bringing mental health on par with physical health. I don't think it's just that. I think it's that plus integrating. So mental health is connected to your physical health is connected to your mental health. For some reason, our society sees them as completely separate things. And I think it's also really important in the bigger picture to recognize that mental health is a societal problem, not just an individual problem. So we often look at one individual's mental health, but actually you're looking at issues around like the benefit sanctions that the UK government bring in, driving extremely poor mental health, poverty, access to all sorts of services, driving poor mental health. In terms of specifics, we'd like to see mental health specialists or mental health first aiders in GP services, in schools, in workplaces. We'd like to see a triage system in every community in Scotland so that people can be quickly assessed by a mental health team and connected to the right forms of support. I also think one thing we're not often talking about enough is mental health support for those delivering health and social care services. So we would be making sure that all health and social care workers have access to dedicated mental health support and counselling. And time as well, time for that, holidays.
I have two more questions for the general panel. So would you support the introduction of regional mayors like in England within Scotland? Angus, do you want to go first on that one?
Yeah, I'm open to persuasion on that. I think if one's looked at what has happened with some of the mayors in England, I think it has given direction to local authorities there. So I'm definitely open to that, as I am in terms of seeing a redistribution of powers, and also join in Miles's openness to potentially having a revising chamber. So I mean, democracy should always be open to review. Unlike others on the panel, I don't think you should pause thinking and doing that. I think we should get on with that. So if there are workable models that are deliverable in our context, we shouldn't be close to that.
Fred, given your party's support for federalism, would you support this kind of federalism in Scotland?
We support increasing powers for local communities and local councils. We don't have a particular policy in favour of elected mayors, but we're not set face against it. I think the most important thing is to ensure that councils have, whoever leads them, have more power to determine their own course of action. In the last 14 years, the SNP have dramatically centralised financial control over councils. They can't really change their taxes without serious penalties. And of course, their budgets have been cut much faster in the last 5 years than the SNP's national budget for the whole of Scotland has been cut. And those budgets passed often with Green support, and the Tories before then, in fact, in the first term of SNP administration, cut councils a lot. So I'm not against it. I was a councillor. When I was a councillor, I was terribly against the idea. But actually, yes, I think there is a point about having some form of leadership. I'm always struck that Edinburgh Council doesn't have any real sense of leadership at the moment. There's no real idea of who's in charge. Back in my day, there was a Labour councillor called Donald Anderson. He was council leader. I often disagree with Donald, but you always knew what he thought. You don't seem to get that anymore, and that's a shame. So we should definitely have that accountability of action again.
Okay, and I have the last question I think we can do, and I'll pose it to Miles and then Maddie. Would the party support the decriminalisation of drugs in Scotland, such as in Portugal? Miles, would you support that?
No, I don't think we should go along the lines of decriminalising drugs. What we need to do is really look at some of the work which has to take place around drug deaths, which I've actually tried to progress in this parliament. When I was first elected, the government would not admit to having a drug deaths crisis. We now have the First Minister announcing there is one and additional funding, but there's lots of things we need to do to turn that around. But I don't think decriminalising drugs is the right direction. And I say that actually as someone who's a member of the Conservative Reform Group around drugs. There's a lot of drugs policies we need to change in this country, but simply decriminalising them, I don't think is the answer.
Maddie?
Yeah, I absolutely support the decriminalisation of drugs. I think that criminalisation has caused massive harms to some of the most vulnerable people in our society, that it's based in classist and racialised ideas of behaviour that have led to the over-policing of certain groups in our society and the over-incarceration of certain groups of our society that has massive knock-on impacts on families, on employment and on communities. There's absolutely no excuse from a health perspective to allow drugs to stay in the hands of criminals when we could be supporting people to ask for help and to find a way out of drug use. Decriminalisation and the war on drugs has catastrophically failed in Scotland, and we need to start acting on the evidence rather than on the prejudice.
Thank you, Maddie. I'm sure we could spend another several hours discussing the important issues at this election, but sadly our time has come. So thank you very much to Maddie Kochman, Miles Briggs, Angus Robertson, Kate Nevens and Fred Mackintosh for being here. It's been a very informative debate. I know I've certainly enjoyed chairing it. Thank you to Bryn and Alex for organising this event as part of the union, Bryn being our outgoing events officer and Alex being our incoming one. And thank you to all of you for coming and listening to the candidates.